Good evening. Over the last few days, you'll know there have been literally thousands, millions of people around the world watching our elections. Many of them are people who have deep experience in covering elections. They understand, if you like, how the world and democracies within the world works. One of the people who watched it here is David Mckenzie. He's CNN's correspondent. He's based in Johannesburg. He has much experience in reporting from Africa, and before that, Beijing, and he's here for you now. David, good evening. Thanks so much for coming in.
Good evening, Stephen.
Firstly, I suppose, you've covered elections all over Africa, and in a way, it's probably half of your job is watching someone vote somewhere. Are our elections that different from other places, or are they pretty much the same?
No, our elections, or the elections in South Africa, and I say our because I am from South Africa, are different because the promise of democracy in South Africa from 94 on to today is such an important story for our audience at CNN and just globally. That narrative, moving from when Nelson Mandela was released from Victor Verster prison through the different permutations of democracy, when South Africans go to the vote here, it means something perhaps more than some of the other countries I've covered. And just to put it into perspective, I've covered elections in Kenya, in Nigeria. Of course, there are no elections in China. And really, the sense is here is that it's an important moment, not just for South Africa, of course, but for democracy in the continent.
It's interesting that, what you have in South Africa is huge involvement in elections. Everyone talks about it. And when I say to other people, to other South Africans who maybe didn't vote, and I say, you're not actually that abnormal, because around the world, often people don't vote. In the United States, only half of people vote.
Well, if you look at the turnout from this election, there has been a lot of talk about the dip in turnout to 65-odd%. That is, as we've been reporting, a significant drop. But compared to other countries in the world and the US, it's massive high turnout. So it shows there still is an interest in democracy. What struck me is that some of the youth that I spoke to in the lead up to this vote, they didn't even bother to register, and those born frees was an important storyline, I think, for the international media in this election.
So much of what's happened in this country is in what people call living memory. In other words, 1994, it is in my living memory, I imagine it is in yours. People remember Nelson Mandela casting his first vote. They remember him being in prison. Many South Africans will remember the fact that he could not be quoted and was banned and what happened before. That means that it's also an opportunity to sort of, when South Africans vote, someone like CNN or whoever will also take viewers and younger viewers back to that time and explain what apartheid actually was. And sometimes if you say to a younger person, this is what apartheid was, they almost don't believe you.
Well, it's incredible, isn't it, for South Africans who had to live through the horror of apartheid and those who observed it, that there is a younger generation that might not know all the details or even just know it in passing. So yes, it's important to look to the past, but also to push it forward to the future. One thing that really struck me, I interviewed a woman in Alexandra. She has a small business making acha, selling it on her own to support her family, 3 kids on her own. And I said, are you voting this time? She said, not since Mandela. She said she voted once, not again until she sees results. So I think that's important to stress that the experiment, as it were, of democracy in South Africa it's a young democracy, but at this point, 25 years on, many people I spoke to are looking for results, and that is kind of the building narrative of the story for the international audience.
One of the things that South Africa has is such a diverse society that, if you go to certain places in this country, you'll see people who look like they could almost literally come from anywhere on earth. How much interest do you find in the elections with CNN's affiliates? Do you find that people around the world are actually quite interested in what's happening here?
Absolutely. All of our stories air on CNN, of course, online, and then amongst our many affiliates around the world. What I've noticed is that there is a great deal of interest in South Africa, in democracy, in both the lead up to this election and in the results. I think there is a reality that some people are facing, though, in South Africa, that it's not an easy sell sometimes. The memory of Nelson Mandela in the eye of some members of the public globally, that's kind of faded with the great man's passing. So now, in terms of the media, in terms of the South African story, even just going to get investment overseas for the president and others, there is a bigger sell that needs to happen. It's just not a natural, necessary link in to South Africa as there was maybe 10 years ago.
It's interesting. our elections made Trevor Noah, and obviously there are reasons as to why that is. But he would not have been allowed to just do that. Some producer somewhere would have said, if you're going to put this on the Daily Show, I don't know if that's a competitor of yours or not. But I mean, that shows that there is a place of popular culture that South Africa has in popular culture.
Absolutely. I mean, I've found that South Africa people around the world want to ask me about South Africa. I was just in Venezuela for nearly a month reporting on the situation there. Many of the people there said, oh, you're from South Africa, tell us about that situation there. How does it compare to our political situation? And there is a general level of understanding, of knowledge about South Africa because of its place on the African continent, the importance of the economy in emerging markets, that does make it easier in a way to tell the story. But as you allude to, Stephen, the complexity of the South African story, of the people, we have to do broad strokes rather than the minutiae of reporting than might be done in the South African media.
Well, I was going to come to that. I mean, South Africa for South African journalists, I mean, you are one, but you know what I mean, for South African media outlets, can sometimes be quite complex to report on. You know, if you're going to try and do the average radio report might be 30 to 40 seconds, you're going to miss half of the nuance of any kind of press conference in that. Do you find it quite difficult to report on South Africa for a foreign audience?
I think every reporting is a challenge. And what is the big challenge for this story, particularly, Stephen, is to try find the most relevant thing that is true to the story without being overly complicated so that people turn off. I think it's our duty as foreign correspondents, local correspondents as well, to get people engaged. And I think one thing is slightly different from what you're describing. Like you have a big following on social media in South Africa, it's a conversation now. It's not just a one-way street. I don't just go out there like an old school correspondent, talk to the TV and the cameras, and then I'm done. It's an ongoing discussion. We get feedback at CNN. We are then trying to find the stories that people are interested in. And it's the same with the local media here. One thing I've noticed since moving to South Africa, I'd never really worked here professionally, permanently as a journalist, having worked in Nairobi and China and the US prior to this, is just how engaging the press is here with the people. Sometimes it gets a little out of hand, but it certainly does make for a vibrant democracy with the press playing an important part in that.
I was wondering if you were going to use the word vibrant. And almost every foreign publication you read in English uses that particular word. South Africa has a vibrant democracy. The Economist's been using it for 20 years. Why is it that word? Is it because so many people are interested? Is it because people protest? Is it because we do politics in a particular way where you see civil society groups? I mean, certainly during the sort of last 5 years of our politics, and I'm referring to the era in which Jacob Zuma was president, we really do see all kinds of people getting involved in politics that maybe it's not quite the same in some other places.
Yes, and I think it's also because of overall, given a few headaches here and there have been several very free and fair elections in South Africa. That isn't the case in many countries around the world, Africa included. So the vibrancy of a democracy requires a free and fair election, otherwise the people's franchise is taken away from them. And I think that is part of the answer to your question. The other is just with the ANC mutating, changing, and with factional battles in the last few years running up to President Ramaphosa now winning the election with the ANC, this is a dynamic give and take democracy in a parliamentary system that does show that with the ebb and flow of different parties and their support base, this is a vibrant democracy. But I think the key there is, compared to other countries that I've covered, where people have their say and that say is then taken away from them, I think that is what kills democracy.
Something that, in my view, has become entrenched in our democracy is transparency and freedom of information. People literally demand information and they get it. It's often leaked, but we get it in the end. You don't see that in other places. You spend time in Beijing. You don't get that there. Does that make, even during our election process, anyone with any kind of cell phone and any kind of data connection can see immediately exactly what is happening in the election counting process. It's hugely important. It removes, I suspect, it removes the questions around what happened in Kenya, say, almost 10 years ago. Do you see that is different to other places, the level of transparency we have here?
Well, I think there are certain countries, of course, that have a very good level of transparency. And you mentioned Kenya. The first 3 days of my job at CNN was covering that election, 2007, 2008. I remember my boss at the time telling me, look, we kind of know what's going to be happening. It should be an easy time. You'll be back home for Christmas. And then, you remember what happened. Part of that was that the transparency in social media in Kenya at the time, you had the very vibrant Kenyan press in those polling booths doing their own counts and releasing it real time, which didn't mesh with the people who wanted to, in effect, have a different result in that election, and that led to weeks of violence and bloodletting in Kenya, which was my first foray into electioneering in Africa for CNN. I think what's different here is that the vibrancy and the transparency is very much mandated by the IEC. Their results come in real time, but I do think, based not just on my experience, I don't want to sound like I'm lecturing, but I do think it's important not to take that for granted, because having seen countries where there's a slip in the press in terms of freedom of press, or there's a electoral commission that gets too swayed by the president or the people in charge, that is very easy to erode in any country, not just in the African context.
Big stories you're waiting for at the moment. Are you that interested in who the premiers are? You're a lot more interested in our cabinet.
I think what we, as international media, will be interested in seeing, and I'm sure investors and just observers, is this promise of a new dawn going to result in action? I think the President Ramaphosa has been given a bit of leeway by investors and those following this country closely, and now I think the ratings agency, as you've been reporting, and the investors will be wanting to see some results. Now, whether the political capital is there is another question. I think for the foreign and international press, that will be very closely watched. How the land question is dealt with in South Africa, given the explosive nature of what we've seen in other countries, and people mention Zimbabwe here, but Brazil and other countries have had to deal with this issue and redressing the past. That will also be something that we watch very closely in the months and years ahead.
David Mckenzie, thank you very much indeed. Really do appreciate it. Thoroughly enjoyed talking to you. He is CNN's correspondent in Johannesburg, covering our elections.